Hi. Do you want the chance to win an all-inclusive holiday of a lifetime? 2 weeks to cruise and indulge in complete luxury? Or maybe to drive the car of your dreams? Then I'm afraid you're in the wrong place. This is the Slick Podcast. Keeping it real and always keeping it groovy.
You have tuned in for a Slick Podcast. I'm here to seek the truth. Live from Scotland around the UK. The one and only Slick Podcast. Enjoy the show. Can I ask important questions? No matter how bizarre the truth might be. Tune in for Slick Podcast. Keeping it real, keeping it groovy.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or a very good day to you when and wherever you're listening from, and a very warm welcome to the show. I'm your host, Simon Laurie King. Let me start off by explaining the reason for not uploading any casts this past 4 weeks. The reason is tragically that death came calling to my family, and she led a wonderful woman away from this life and into the next. My mother-in-law was a beautiful lady and is desperately missed by us all. Believe me when I tell you that it was my absolute privilege to have known her, as she was everything decency demands in a person. And in this current world that we live, amongst the darkness and wicked intention of others, I can absolutely attest to the fact that she was a thoroughly good and kind person. Something that is sadly lacking in so many others. And although she has passed from this life and through the great veil, she will never pass from our hearts. Coming up on today's show, it's the return of friend of the show, Jared Murphy, and he's here to fill us in on his upcoming expedition to the Grand Canyon in the United States of America. If you remember from episode 8, this planned expedition isn't walking along well-travelled paths, carrying a trowel and brush, hoping to find something. No, it certainly isn't. Jared and his team are going to be scaling some of the toughest cliff faces of the Grand Canyon, in some places thousands of feet from the canyon floor, subsequently putting their lives at great risk to gain access to and exploring the cave systems. Why? To seek the truth, as Jared is all about that, and through this very dangerous mission hopes to dispel or prove some of the myths or misdirected alleged finds from our own ancient past. Jared will be filming all of this first expedition, and it promises to make for an exciting documentary that I really look forward to seeing. Joining us also today is Howdie Mickoski from Howdie Mickoski Talks on YouTube. Howard's subject matter is huge. Ancient Egypt, the Holy Grail, the Cathars, the high strangeness that the world's fairs in the 1800s to the early 1900s, and very relevant for us today, Howdie also talks of Plato's cave and explores this analogy and its important lessons, especially for the strange times we live in and the shadows we ourselves perceive as reality. I would definitely describe Howdie as a free thinker, and he regularly shares his musings about many subjects on his channel and encourages his audience to participate and debate the questions and findings of the many subjects he covers. Howdie and Jared are both regular guests on the many bigger podcasts that have been established far longer than my newly struggling show, but they are two of the most interesting people I've ever had the pleasure to have spoken to, and so without further delay, it's my absolute pleasure and excitement to welcome Jared Murphy and Howdie Mickoski back to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Gentlemen, it's really good to have you here today, and my cup truly runneth over. Jared, we are going to start off with my first question for you. And Howdie, please jump in with questions of your own for Jared. After this, my next question is for you. And Jared, again, come in with any questions for Howdie. Please keep your answers reasonably a certain length, so to allow more content, but I insist you feel free to go down any rabbit hole you need to. So having said that, let's get the ball rolling on this one. Jared, you came onto the show on episode 8 of this Virgin podcast, really, and you explained the plan, the initial plan to go to, after I'd said to you about my reading up on your idea about Kincaid and the Smithsonian Institute back in 1901, I believe, they found Egyptian so-called, air quotes, artifacts in the Grand Canyon somewhere, maybe in a cave system. And you talked to us on the show about your idea to rappel down the cliff faces, taking your own life in your hands and that of your team. And now you've moved it forward and you're off to the Grand Canyon in less than a week. So again, I ask you, Jared, why? But I do salute your bravery. But again, why, Jared? Break this down for us.
I think as everyone's become more and more fascinated with the past, we all have genetic stored memories. We all have hunches about our origins, and we all have an interest in answering those questions. And in doing the research and in beyond fascinated with the overall subject, in doing the writing I've done and the research I've done, it's always been and was my intent. And having traveled, my first field research was in South Africa, really out of country, and being amongst thousands of square kilometers of ruins that have either been written off or not explored. The Kincaid story is similar. You have a fascinating dialogue. The story itself becomes a fascinating conversation because the story doesn't get old. It gets retold and told again on radio shows, podcasts, shows like Ancient Aliens or whatever. I mean, it comes up, and there's this constant narrative of, hey, here's another example of the Smithsonian showing up, taking something, not admitting to something, plausible deniability, and it goes on and on and on. And in this case, it's not a matter of, hey, let's go at one of these just an urban legend or a April Fool's prank. In this particular case, we have a geological entity of the Grand Canyon existing well within the time frame of giant megalithic builders. And so to get out in the field, to help everyone get their own eyes on it, the idea is to, of course, safely, when you do things, you can mitigate a lot of risk as a climber. It doesn't matter the height. If your equipment is correctly set, it doesn't matter if you're 60 feet or 20 feet or 2,000 feet off the ground. You may or may not have a failure, but it's usually a user error. And it's not. The team that I am fortunate to know are incredible climbers. And so the issue isn't going to be, and not just climbers, but specifically people who can set these kind of ascents or descents. And I mean, I know what I'm doing, but I would defer to all the gentlemen that are coming. And in this case, going to the Grand Canyon is about that beyond dynastic and the 12,000 years of history that academia is crumbling on, facing that North America has been occupied by anatomically correct humans for tens of thousands of years. We know this, and not just North America, but South and Central America. We know this. So we have a long history, and the Grand Canyon at its height, we have a lot of mysterious caves that there are just some obvious mysteries that we're going to start putting on the table by doing the field research to table new questions, more questions, different questions, and eliminate the very fun up until now general dialogue around the campfire that there's a story about Egyptians in the Grand Canyon. If we find hieroglyphs, if we find something Phoenician or Roman or Celtic or Templars or Vikings, I mean, those are all interesting period finds. But and it proves that, like the Amphora Bay down in Brazil, there's clearly a lot of travel to North, Central, and South America in the last 6,000 years. But we're looking for ruins, and what would be left at this point would likely be just the rock cut openings, and not from the 1840s miners or from Smithsonian research. We are just looking for the evidences that in the last 100,000 years or more, that there have been pre-Younger Dryas dwellings where the river would have been higher, and or a more advanced society who's moving 3,000 and 1,000 ton polygonal stones, like at Baalbek, Lebanon, and in Siberia, and from Machu Picchu to Sacsayhuaman, and now in the Grand Canyon, geologically, there is just natural and likely camouflaged ancient ruins. And so to go in the field to answer your question, to answer everyone's questions, to start tabling in a public way and in a way that everyone can participate in and get lots of eyes on, it's exciting and fun, because I think this renaissance of research is going to need not just field research again, which is achievable through site visits, droning, DSLR. I mean, the camera technology now, there's just so many ways that we can put eyes on very mysterious places, but we have technologies now right down to sedimentary nuclear DNA testing, and all of it, all these new sciences and all this general interest, I think, really hits a hyper focus point when you go to the sites and you start making realistic assessments of these, what are becoming, I hate to throw it up to urban myth, but the reality is we have this one story about G.E. Kincaid and so much speculation, and yet I just would like to resolve the issue of where is it, if it does exist, or ironically, with the limitless or unknown number of caves, we may not know exactly where that cave is, but finding rock cut ruins that indicate a higher level of technology or a society beyond those of the last 12,000 years, I think will also be exciting.
Well, I have, that gives me a whack of questions, but I'll pick one to get us going. Have you had a chance to spend some time in preparation talking with the Navajo, which would be their part of their natural heritage area, to see if there are any specific, we'll just call it myths that are not often told, things that are sort of kept quiet from the normal population, or information that might be able to be shared with you? I'm just curious if you've had any contact with them on preparation on your trip.
Short answer is yes.
Okay.
And what's important, I guess, for everyone listening is what blows my mind in archaeology in general, Western society. Everything Western is important. And by that, I mean the Fertile Crescent, Garden of Eden, Western Christianity, and everything else is silly. And the reality is the majority of the world has other mythologies, stories, actually very much religion is so far away from the Western idea that the Greeks are the best and everything else in the East is just kind of silly and weird and off. And in the case of indigenous people, archaeology that's grown up in Western Europe and the collegiate system, the academic system, they're beyond second-class citizens. And it blows my mind that my co-author now on my next few books, our books, is Jen Deo, and her dissertation and her work was with indigenous people, and it was very out of line. It's not about her story, but I think as in relevance to this, she was frowned on by her academic environment for choosing to work with indigenous people directly. And the arrogance and the hubris that was experienced by her, I think, is a good example in this case, where they could not believe it was a case of the collegiate system is going to tell indigenous people what they know about their past. And generally indigenous people do not work with anthropologists and archaeologists as a group, in quotes, because they don't respect or care about their perspective, or they find it silly or simplistic. And it's the absolute opposite of that. It is unbelievable, the narrative that is created by these Western academic systems that has caused, in most cases, and quite deserving so, a shutdown of communication of the true, literally, I would call it more truthful, even if they're religious or mythos or something, the hero with 1,000 faces, we're thinking Joseph Campbell here. And these people's stories are living stories. They're oral traditions that cannot be rewritten by Gregorian monks in the Middle Ages and corrected, in quotes, to the correct and proper, well, this is how this thing went actually for, as an example, the Bible or history. You don't have anyone rewriting, and for 1,000 years, it gets forgotten what was written. And we have a very muted view of our own history, even the one from an academic standpoint, because it was mutated by monks. And in this case, when you have an oral tradition that's sacred and holy and has been with a living, breathing people for thousands of years, you don't have that. Yes, people embellish, but the things that they hold closest in this oral tradition, they don't change. And you can get a lot more accuracy, even if if we want to call it like, hard knock science truths out of slivers of these people's stories, because they are truer and less, again, adapted. And in this case, for the Navajo Nation, we're fortunate that Rex from Leak Project, he has good friends and people that are part of the nation. And I'm looking forward to, in reference to, I got this experience in South Africa with some of the local and nearby nation indigenous tribes. I think the stories and the histories, when they are willing to share, need to be the highest priority for us to get a compass on even the near past, even their adaptations. And every 500, 1,000, 100 years of history is important. So even if their stories relate directly just to them, there are always pointers to they lived near a certain society or a certain place that had a certain meaning. And everyone that we're going to be able to actually sit down in person and connect and meet with, that Rex knows, is something I am so excited about, because this is a chance for us to put aside Western, top down, well, here's what we think. It's like, why don't we shut up and listen?
Howard, do you want to come back in?
Oh, just waiting for you, Simon.
No, go on. Carry back in. Carry on. I'll just say one thing, Jared. That do you? I know as somebody who's travelled the world and has got a book. Well, there's you've got at least another book coming out, but you've got a book dedicated to questioning that which we're told, the narrative. But do you give any credence to the dynastic peoples, so the Egyptians, having been to North America, having been to the Grand Canyon? Do you give any credence to this, or are you going to say, well, that's why I'm going? I mean, do you give any credence to that?
No, you're right. It's, first off, I really, honestly, this would be fun for people in the future, and we have it recorded, but I'm not expecting to find anything Egyptian. I'm really not. Not because the Egyptians didn't make it to North America or were trading with South America. The tobacco, cocaine / again, Amphora Bay. You clearly have the Romans in Brazil all day long. Not one ship off course, but I think you have a consistent trade route that's been open. And the Egyptians, I think there's more indications of the Egyptians in Australia, physical indicators that you can point to, inscriptions that appear to be dynastic. And so as far as the rest of this trip goes, again, if we found something, it'd be super interesting, but I'm not expecting Egyptian in that area. If it happens, great. But again, I'm more interested in the fact that it is the motivator for the 49ers and the early miners that were looking for not just gold, but any kind of precious mineral that could be mined by a mining company. There were people who explored the Grand Canyon, but by exploring, it's up to 6,000 feet deep, and many places at 5,000 feet deep. And to get up a sheer rock wall or to descend on any kind of rope in any period of time, and this is something that you could argue any sailor who worked on any rigging would be able to accomplish, maybe blindfolded, that the descent is in length. These are tough guys, tough people, tough breed of human being. So you could argue that they made it different locations within the canyon, but the canyon's incredibly large. Most of what would be pre-dynastic, pre-12,000 years ago, and even at 12,000 years, you're talking about a significant, possible location shift for anything in the canyon wall. And the reality is that when you look pre-dynastic, when you look to Waiatlaco, and we talked about this off air, Michael Cremo has been champion Virginia Steen McIntyre for years. And there's a site that's found in northern central Mexico, Waiatlaco, and they found anatomically correct humans. They found a site that was dated by a team of geologists, and Virginia Steen McIntyre was the head of this team, rising star in geology. Very, this is an expert in her field, and they identified this site to be at least 275,000 years old, to which the anthropologist said, hey, that's not true. It can't be. And we have, long story short, now the site's been reassessed to be 350 to 500,000 years old. And that's just one example. There is a site also in northern central Mexico that has a pyramid that National Geographic studied. I wrote about it in my book, but this is a site that has a lava flow on top of it. And what's important about that is the lava flow runs about 7 miles wide, or 7 to 15 miles wide. And then it was over an abandoned pyramid. So the minimum is 8,000 or 9,000 years old for this pyramid to have not been buried, but it had 34 feet of dirt, of sediment, of just compost, of abandonment on top of it, and then the lava flow. So the issue is, okay, well, if we eliminate the lava flow from 8,000 years ago, we're still dynastic periods here, right? We're still within 12,000 years, but the abandonment could push this this primitive pyramid structure to 18,000 years, which is no big deal. But the Grand Canyon, if we have, and we're not talking Neanderthal, we're talking, or Denisovan or other human species, we're just talking humans. So if 275, 350,000 years ago, you have campfires and you have humans here, we always have, just like today, tribes of people that just don't exist, that within modern culture, they live primitively, in quotes. They have no access to CVS pharmacy, and they just go about their lives, and they create Aeolus, Neolus. If their campsites were to be found in thousands of years, it would look like, oh, very primitive people lived in this time period. But we live with a different level of technology, and people building polygonal and large cymatic frequency energy type machinery, from the Great Pyramid stuff to Sacsayhuaman. This society would be also maybe in the Grand Canyon. We have very different coastlines, from, like, just a reminder, like Scotland to Norway, to that area. The Baltic was more of a lake. You have Doggerland. So you have tens of thousands of square miles of river, valley, and land that connected from Scotland to France. And that whole area from Sweden, Russia, Norway, that whole area looked very differently even 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. But you hit 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, Doggerland's in full bloom. And by 15,000 years ago, it's definitely this mass of a continent that is now underwater. And the reality is that the coastlines here in America and the Caribbean and the Mediterranean looked very, very differently than what we're looking at now. So the societies that, if they were high tech and moving large megalithic blocks and needed sand, silicretes, just like what was found out about Stonehenge recently that was just published, if you were moving or mining, if the Grand Canyon was part of a mining operation or system, it might explain some of the geology that's, just, it's not just natural erosion. It could be natural erosion from a combination of natural, in quotes, and abandonment. And the anthropologists and archaeologists are not easily accessing anything forget 1,000, even 100, 200 feet off the floor of the canyon right now. If you are not a climber, is a very difficult thing to do. So you have no droning until recently, but there isn't any anthropologists and archaeologists running through the Grand Canyon right now going, well, let's check out this cave or let's check out that cave. There's a narrative to maintain. So on the other hand, for those of you who want to jump and get excited about the possibility of conspiracy, there is no motive to find something like Egyptian, Phoenician, Celtic, Templar, Viking ruins or writings of any kind that would, which by the way are found all over the North American area, and Carl Ehrberger's book about it, it's pretty significant. I think that there are many, many legitimate finds that show that these other peoples that were here in recent years, in the last couple, 2,000-3,000, but the championed, unspoken, older, even, so, you know, if we want to call them in quotes, simplistic tribal dynastic peoples that are unknown pre 12,000 years ago, even if it's just them, even if it's just cave art with more bisons or fill in the blank, anything between that, beyond a ladder reach to even, 20, 30 feet over the top of the canyon, it's very unlikely that the majority of these caves have ever been explored, ever, by anyone.
Jared, can I just come in for Howard may want to ask you a question. Could you briefly, because I really want to ask Howard a couple of questions, but could you briefly tell us where you're at with your mission to the Grand Canyon at the moment? As in, I know you're away there within the next week. Are you going to be rappelling down the cliff face now, or is it more of a reconnaissance?
100% reconnaissance, because it is incredibly dangerous to, this is not scaling. Yosemite, for instance, is, there are rock faces that are well known for rock climbing. The routes, there's books on the routes there. Even if you've never been there as a climber, there are places you go in the world, like Waterval Boven in South Africa, where I was. I did do climbing there, but those routes are explored. Now, there are many that aren't climbed, but in South Africa, but there are many, many, many places where there are 3, 4, 5,000 foot rock faces, but they've been charted. Nothing about the Grand Canyon's been charted. It is very dangerous to just grab rope and gear and cams and nuts and just to attempt to do this without a significant level of planning. I'm not saying we're going to the moon, but in the narrative, we want to make sure that when we explore and photograph and of course, because to the earlier question, first and foremost, I'm looking forward to speaking with Navajo Nation people, and of course, making sure that as their guests, we also not only hear about anything, any folklore, any legends, any myths, any traditions, anything that they want to share or are willing to share and trust with us. We also want to make sure that we are entering as their guests in a respectful way.
That's a good sentiment, and I think the only sentiment. Howard, would you like to come in with a question for Jared before I move on to yourself?
No, you can go on. I guess the next one. If something comes up, I can reach.
Okay, because we'll all be revisiting this subject, Jared. Okay, so Howard, I would describe you as a scholar, writing books and helping others with your video presentations and effectiveness. A scholar, in my eyes, is someone who draws upon, and definitely from outside, also of mainstream academia, someone who strives for the plain insight and someone that searches for the hidden truths and is willing to share and best explain that which is the truth as honestly as they see it to be, and always with a good heart. Agree or disagree with my perception, this is how I see you, Howard. The subject matter that you cover are vast, and the details to which you offer an easy path of understanding to this subject is always well laid out. Because of the times we live in, I think we should start with your video presentations on the analogy of Plato's cave, as they are excellent, as they are refreshing. The analogy here of my own would be the bucket of cold water. A shock to the system, certainly yes, when felt, but an awakening nonetheless. So can you explain the analogy and concept of this cave and how we should all recognize the shadows from what actually is causing the casting of them?
Well, that's a pretty large question. Thank you for your comments about me. I've put 25 years of research into just about everything I felt I could touch my hands on, including the things that, Jared is doing there in the Grand Canyon. I found that extremely interesting for a good 3 or 4 months of time. And if we're going to take the analogy of Plato's cave, which is, of course, a piece of a story that comes through Greek literature, and of course, Plato was, whoever Plato was, him and Socrates were taught by the ancient Egyptians. What you're really looking at is a metaphor for standard reality. And really, if you look at the metaphor, easier to explain to a modern person, rather than explain it as a cave, it's better to explain it as a movie theater, because you've got the light source at the back, you've got the shadows that are appearing on the screen, and the people who are, in a sense, what they're called prisoners, chained to their seats in chains that are not locked. So the metaphor becomes, I think, very useful into describing everything that we've come to know about our life from the standpoint of, what is this thing? Why are they called prisoners? Why would they be in? Because it's not explained in Plato's in the actual story. They're not. They're just said they're prisoners and they're chained in the seats in the cave. Well, prisoners from what? Where did they come from? Why are they prisoners? Why are they not free? None of this is explained. It just kind of just laid there. And so the first questions that should have been asked at the beginning of this Plato's cave dialogue aren't. They're automatically skipped over, and then they move into the story. And these are all things that we have to even start with in order to begin to dig through our own perception and misperception, our own concepts of reality and self, in order to begin to dig through the cave analogy. And then, to keep it very short, the videos that you're talking about try to take the next step of what happens when the prisoner gets out of the cave, sees they've been a prisoner, sees they've been fooled, but now they move to somewhere else in the cave, thinking that they've moved to a freer point, when all they've really done is change their vantage point in the cave to something a little more less confining, but nonetheless false. So that's kind of the overview of where those videos are trying to take people, to get them to kind of really examine the cave. And of course, that requires some heavy duty exercises to test.
Do you think that it is important that a lot of people, my personal opinion aside, which I actually think, yes, it is, to understand that that analogy stands absolutely true, or to understand the analogy? And I'd like you to come in here, Jared, with your opinion in a second, or a question for Howard, that people must, especially what's going on, without being too political, absolutely must understand this analogy, and to see, for want of a better word, to see the shadows, and more importantly, what is causing those shadows. What would you say about that?
Well, it's if someone's going to ever leave the cave, then yes, it obviously has to become a focal point of one's search. They have to become sort of a philosopher of understanding. How many actually get that push, though? I mean, it's not like you could just go down the street and open up Plato's cave to somebody and say, see, look at this, you should be studying this for your life. 98% of people will just shut the thing and keep walking and forget about you. So it's already a very small group of people who are going to be interested. I'm not trying to say they're more advanced, less advanced, better, worse. It's just there are certain places that people are in their life, based on their life experiences, that begin to push them into areas where they want to question more. Generally, the more trauma or difficulty someone has, the more likely someone could be to want to go to a much deeper explanation than what is presented quite simply. For me, it started when I was trying to look for the truth of ancient Egypt 25 years ago, when I realized the archaeological books were wrong, were obviously misleading, that there was something, the sites and the stonework and everything else was obviously not done anywhere close to the way that they were describing. And I plunged myself for a number of years into trying to understand something that was against the narrative. So in one way, as soon as someone goes against the narrative on any level, they're examining Plato's cave.
Well, I have a question.
Go ahead, Jared. Go ahead.
Go.
In all your years of research, as you've been looking, do you ever have, and I don't want to stereotype the average standard academic, but do you see any, because there's two parts that cross. One is, on one level, I'm shocked. I have a couple layers to this. One is it's not funny anymore to look at the process of learning wisdom. And it's something that I naively thought the background is this. From a collegiate standpoint, I thought that wisdom is something that would want to be taught in academic environments. And I realize it's not. And so there's a duality to me between it's a bizarre, I don't understand if it's parasitic or just naivety or complete, somehow this duality of ignorance where you have something like the classics and the idea of wisdom and what that means and discernment, yet you have an academic environment that really creates nothing less than high school agreement, or again, there are safe things to question, but you better stay within the parameters of here's the rules of what we're playing. And I'm just wondering, so with that background, the question I had wanted to ask was, do you see anyone who's really, entrenched in this system? Do you see any way, after all your years of research, to look at this system and with what you know about Egypt as a perfect example, do you see any way of the system is there any way to correct the system, or is it completely broken and we really just have to work in a new world without them?
It's completely broken, right? It's, I went through my university, got my degree as a historian, great, thought I knew what I was doing, thought at the beginning of my original research that I could read my way to understanding, because that's sort of in a sense the way we were taught as students in university. And it wasn't until I got lucky enough to meet some people who introduced me to like the Korean Zen teacher that I had for 6 months, or the native Indian medicine men that I spent time with on their reservations, or the Qigong teachers from China or whatnot. And it wasn't until there were people who were starting to teach me how to understand myself and how to understand what I've always thought reality was, it's not tangible, it's not solid, it's a very flowing mass of waveforms is really the best way to describe it once you start to see it and touch it and work with it in a different way. So as long as someone has their head in a book and believes a book, no matter what the book is going to be the answer to everything, they're not getting the work to go within where real answers are going to be found, where real openings, where real doorways are to be found. And that's not to say not every, I've met a couple of truly academic individuals. I don't know if I want to say his name on the air, but there's an archaeologist that I met in Mexico on my first trip when I was down studying the Mayan sites. And he was working very closely with an old Mayan medicine a shaman, I guess is the best way to describe it. And I met him, and then he took me to dinner with the shaman. And it was one of the most fascinating conversations, even though this older gentleman didn't say much. Everything he said, I still pretty much remember it to this day, the things he said to me, which were all very poignant, very direct about my life and my life's work and what I was doing in my life. And so there are a few out there, I think, who are making these connections, but they're very few. And I think they keep it generally quiet because they know if they say too much about what they're doing, they'll either be looked down upon by their colleagues, they'll lose their funding, so I think there are some out there who you might classify as academic experts, but what they do beyond that, they keep generally to themselves and stay within the box. The rest of it is just the box. And the box is not going to get broken.
It's just challenging. I wrestle with that thought of, okay, you got tens of thousands of objects stored in boxes, like it's Indiana Jones and the Ark and the getting boxed up, top men working on it. And then you have, I can't even have nightmares anymore about the number of stories of, yeah, well, the fact we found doesn't fit the theory, so we threw the fact out, or stories by firsthand accounts of they found something and they admittedly reburied it because it didn't fit. And all I can picture is these brainwashing, whitewashing, Victorian stuck, business models is what it really is they would rather protect that model than the very truths of the truth. And they are running around in mass with either by the pen or literally by the hammer and destroying our history annually, by the decade, either by I mean, at the best is if they leave it alone, but I'm just I wrestle with just, do we work with them? Do we try to encourage them to a new business model? Because I 3/4 think they're too dumb to get it, and it's really just about money. They've written too many books, too many ways, and have crowned themselves king of knowledges. And it's bizarre at this point. It's like they're standing in front of a giant space shuttle wreck saying,
it's more than that. It's actually deeper than that. It's actually a energetic frequency that they have adopted.
What do you think?
Actually, on the level of like a vibration beyond just money or these ideas, or they've been brainwashed. It's literally they've taken on a different frequency.
So they've turned it into a meditation that, because it's gone generational now, it's written into again, quite harmfully, but at our 10 to 15% consciousness, you would say that it's a methodology that's literally genetically encoded at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the book I wrote on the World's Fairs a couple of years ago, to me now takes on even more precedence, because I'm pretty sure all of the things that we consider history were invented during that period between 1850 and 1900. So before 1850, there's no such thing as history of the way we know it. Everything was manufactured during this period of the fairs, and everything that has come. And it was almost given like a magic spell. That's the best way I can describe it. A magic spell was put on all of this. And so as soon as it was downloaded and you accepted Napoleon or Waterloo, or you accept the story of the Mayans, or it doesn't matter what it is, you're almost in some weird way taking in the magic spell. And to break that historical magic spell we all take is not an easy thing. And once you've, like you say, once then you make it your profession and your life and your livelihood, the spell is really strong.
That's interesting. I'm assuming you're familiar with Newton's book on time and the chronology of histories.
Yep.
How does that get ignored? Okay, for everyone out there, I'm asking a question about Newton. Just besides the whole apple on the tree and gravity thing, it got on my radar when I was doing the research for my original book that he basically, the time frame we are given to Roman periods or the Dark Ages is very much buffered in with fake years, and Newton's books seem to eliminate that. But how do they write that off, or how is that? That's my question. It's like, you're familiar with it, but why isn't it more commonly, like, even from an alternative history standpoint, I don't understand why that's not one of the go-tos for our history, is like they made up years. How is that not brought up?
It's hard to know for sure. I mean, to actually start looking into our history and realizing it's pretty much all a lie, is pretty intense for anybody. And it's like anything. It's like the period we're in right now. It doesn't matter. Something that is foundational, and history is a foundation of one's life. It explains why things are the way we are. Why is our government like it is? Why do we use money? How did cars get here? Everything, right? It's linked to history. So if you start pulling out the rug of history and start saying, well, actually, this is not true. This is not true. Then we don't know what's true, but not this, not this, not this. People have to start questioning everything about their reality, because, well, then why are we still doing this if we don't have the historical record that tells us this is how we got here and this is why this is a good thing to be doing today? So it's better to just keep the wall up and just protect. It's a protection mechanism, because once you start pulling one card out, you're going to start pulling more and more and more cards out, and then you might actually have to start looking at the final card, right? Well, do I even exist at all? Does the thing in the mirror that I see every day, is that really real or not? Or am I as much of a fiction as history itself? So it's this gigantic, it's a wall within Plato's cave that just says, I want to stay safe, protected, and just go about my day-to-day life and not get bothered. That would be my simple explanation for it all. Sure.
Okay, so on that, I had a totally different semi-related direction, but the other question is, since you spend time looking at Central South American history, I think it's one of all the ancient mysteries of this megalithic society that's gone, one of the things that, and that's an oversimplification, but to get to the question, I find whatever happened in Central or South America uber fascinating when it comes to the overall story. And the reason I say that is because the Great Pyramid, yes, it was repaired, it was adapted for dynastic use. But what fascinates me most about the Mayan question to me is, you have the greatest devastation of those large, ancient, high frequency energy whatever they are, where what fascinates me, and the question is that since you know some of these archaeologists and anthropologists, my question is, you're looking at a pyramid, or you're looking at any sort of dynastic stone structure, Mayan, Olmec, Toltec, whatever, Aztec, and mud brick, simple brick, giant 700,000 ton megalithic block in the middle. How do they get around that elephant in the room? I really want to know your opinion on, do they see that the puzzle piece is just absurd? Do they ask, do they question, what makes no sense? You know what I mean? It's totally different levels of technology in the building.
Right, and they would generally try to religious significance. This meant something special to them religiously, so and they have a massive amount of manpower. They could use 100,000 people, and this was all part of their religion, and so it was that, and then they'll just move on to the next subject.
Oh my God!
Yeah, it's like when you see when they take people to the Giza Plateau and you show them some of the granite stones that are there, the ones that are either laser cut or have the perfect rounded corners and the perfect polish on them, the things that you need a diamond laser drill kind of things to make it today, right? Yeah. And then if you ask one of these people, oh yeah, copper tools, they just well, can you do that today? Why don't you take a copper tool and here's a granite stone? Why don't you make that for me? Oh, no, it takes generations. The father has to teach the son, and the son teaches the son, and it takes many generations to perfect that kind of quality. We can't do it today, but if we just had enough generations, these are the answers that they give, that they justify to themselves to not have to think about it.
We'll be right back after this message.
Hi, I'm Jazz from CarolonBuckets.com. Here at Carolon Buckets, we have an extensive range of sleek, stylish, functional, and of course, sexy 21st century buckets that carry and contain in a high-tech and user-friendly way that will definitely suit your modern lifestyle bucket needs. For the upwardly mobile, whether a business mogul or student, rest assured all of our cutting-edge buckets come with USB ports and are of course Bluetooth enabled. Use the promo code SlickPodcast21 to get a whopping 5% off of our agricultural, horticultural, and correctional facility ranges. CarolonBuckets.com. When it comes to buckets, others just pale in comparison. Carolon, we have a handle on it.
Sleep Podcast. The Sleep Podcast. Yeah, it's a Sleep Podcast. Truly unforgettable topic. This is Sleep Podcast.
It's, I know it's been a decade coming, but whether it's Ancient Origins to Science Daily, the articles now about nuclear DNA testing, and I already see it problematic in that, they're identifying the flora and fauna of Doggerland. They're actually doing it, and that means somebody's bothering to go and get seafloor samples and digging down and saying, okay, well, here's what was on Doggerland 9,000 years ago, and this sedimentary DNA response, they've done the testing and said this Neanderthal sequencing, and we found 127 other animals in this cave, and I already see a big elephant in the room, because they're going to find things that don't fit the narratives, but now they're going to do it at nuclear DNA level, and it's, what scientist who is doing the pragmatic testing is going to choose to ignore at this point? Like, how hard is it going to be for the actual technician to say, yeah, well, you found 127 species of animals, but you also found 20 DNA strands from 20 humans that you didn't know existed, or this looks like the sedimentary remains of a laptop. You know what I mean? There's on one hand a can of worms, and I'm wondering if it's going to be, if the quantity or the avalanche of potential raw data is going to be would that be enough to break that frequency or that mind barrier? Is that enough?
We're going on to see Simon. Do you have anything you want to jump in here with?
To be honest with you, you guys are making this really, really easy for me, because let's not forget that people are tuning in to listen to. To be honest here, let's lay it on the line. Two giants in your field. Really, you're not battling against each other. You're standing on the hill, as I see it, and you're defending the truth. And I applaud you both for that. So really, that's really what I wanted to add. But if I would really like to bring it forward a few thousand years, and then we'll go back again. Howard, can you just give us a reminder, please, of the strangeness? We don't have to go all the way in. Just the strangeness, as an example, of the World Fair's impossibility of building such things in 2 years for Jared's benefit as well as our own, and then we could draw parallels, like 1,000-ton stones, dragging them with lime ropes with greasy logs. Nonsense, as in nonsense. Could we just touch on that a little, please, Howard, if you don't mind?
Sure. And I guess, Jared, you probably have never studied the fairs from the 1800s, I'm guessing.
I'm aware of the. No, I was fascinated by them when I was young, and I do historical remodeling. So for 20 years, I started on Summit and Grand Avenue, which Summit, for people who don't know, is one of the most intact 1800s period mansion, industrialist ridden, Park Avenue in Chicago, and there's another one in Philadelphia that are the most intact avenues in the country. And I started doing historical remodeling 20 years ago, and so I've always been fascinated with history and the World's Fair, particularly Chicago, and then of course the horror murder house, and all that aside, I find the architecture, having also personally to put my hands on it, and I do a lot of restoration. So it's a lot of, people want modern things, but then they want, hey, don't take down that rusty tin ceiling. Can you patch it in with something that matches? And so I end up in a lot of very weird, bizarre, having to mimic or duplicate or re-engineer or reinvent a way to create something that matches something. It's a very bizarre, unique thing. It's very different than building a new home. That's a no-brainer. But to do the kind of, the combo of the new and the old and the restoration aspect of it in the last 20 years, for me, it's most of what I've dealt with and on a rental level has been, gangster history, Minnesota, front and center between the Chicagoland, from Al Capone to John Dillinger to, back to the 1800s. Again, we're dealing with, Summit Avenue. You have James J. Hill, who connected the Intercontinental Railway to connect our country. His home is literally across the street from the cathedral. And so the dynamics between political power, religious power, the industrial titans of the period, I'm a super huge fan of the whole thing. And so I'm familiar, to answer your question, with the concept that maybe a lot of these structures were pre-existing. I'm familiar with that theory, if that's ultimately where we're going, but I would love to hear you expand on it.
Sure. Just to give a short overview then, because for those who know, A couple of years ago, after I got back from studying cathedrals in Florence, I bumped into the Chicago Exposition first for 1893. And here was supposedly 700 acres of buildings that are beyond giant. One of them, the manufacturer's building, could house 300,000 people. It was the largest building in the world. And you add towers and domes and canals and lakes and electrical trains and electrical walkways, and every country, every state that had a building. It was all supposed to have been planned and built in 2 years, right, with no modern machines, no nothing. And as soon as these expositions were completed, they were generally blown up, dynamited, and thrown into landfills. And this was repeated over and over again, be it Chicago, be it Nashville, be it St. Louis, be it Buffalo, be it San Francisco. And here's Chicago, which has supposedly just gone through a giant fire. San Francisco, which has supposedly gone through this giant earthquake. So let's build a whole bunch of these massive buildings when we probably need buildings anyway. And then as soon as it's over, we'll blow the whole thing up and dynamite it and get rid of it. So when I first saw the overlay of the story itself seemed so stupid that obviously something else was going on. And then it wasn't until I began the actual in-depth study of reading the material from the time period about each of these fairs that you began to see these things were crazy. Like the actual thing, never mind the buildings, the stuff they were actually doing at these fairs was crazy. And that's when I started to realize, oh my God, these are the indoctrination centers of the day. These were without television, without movies, without the news. If you wanted to get a population to believe something, set up these fairs all over the world, get the main people to go there, and lo and behold, they're going to believe what you've just shown them. And so that whole package to me, and that whole period, indicates the 1800s are a giant question mark, because I went and saw a lot of building contractors to ask, and I showed all the photos, whether it be St. Louis or Buffalo or Paris or whatever. And I just said, can you build this today in 2 years? And the answer was no. Even with like 50,000 guys and unlimited budget and all the modern machines, they were very clear. There's no way you can do this in 2 years. They said planning itself would take 2 years because of all the hard work with the water systems and the swamps and the things you've got to build. And then you're going to put 2 or 3 years into landscaping. And then maybe you're going to modern machines now, like today, you're maybe going to take 10 or 15 years because you're talking about complete finish, really quality ornamentation. So they're talking minimum with an unlimited budget, like, $1 billion and 50 or 100,000 guys, they're saying 15 years. So how the hell did they do this stuff in the 1890s with nothing?
Can I just come in here, Howard? Am I right in saying?
Yeah, of course.
Am I right in saying that? I'm just going to stab at one. Say maybe it was Buffalo, could have been Chicago, but the depiction of the Holy Land itself, just the depiction of the Holy Land itself, the exhibit, air quotes, had 22 streets and was spread over 7 acres and had hundreds of actors. Or did I hear that wrong?
That's St. Louis.
St. Louis.
Yeah, St. Louis had these exhibits on its midway, the Pike area, and they had about 30 different historical places that you can go to that had, thousands of actors. I'll give you one, for example, was the Siberian train ride. So the Siberian train ride was these giant cars that you would get into. And then, of course, they would shake the car and then they would move the scenery on the side to make you think like you were moving through Russia. Then they would stop. They have changed all the set. And now you would be in one town and you'd meet all the actors and you do whatever. And then they'd be back on the train and zip, zip, zip. And then they change the whole thing. And then you'd be in another town in Russia. And then you'd be somewhere else. And this was being done for ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, Jerusalem, Ireland, for the Alps of Germany, for the medieval streets of Paris. It was like this massive historical Disneyland, basically, with probably 50,000 actors. And just think of the scale of just seeing something like that and how that would have affected your psyche.
It's completely mind-boggling. Jared, thoughts on that?
Yeah, here's a question I got for you. And again, I'm very familiar with historical remodeling and into large buildings, and I've worked with large buildings, like 20,000 square feet. I've taken buildings. I've definitely done the hard, larger structural work, and I've had 40 people working on a building. And one of the things I wonder, as my only example, the First National Bank building, which is on the historical register, and a lot of people don't know, a lot of the marble in America, for instance, and in this particular case, not just marble, granite, Cold Spring. It's one of the biggest companies ever in our country, and it's located right in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and it supplied two very famous buildings. One not so famous. The First National Bank building has a big number 1 on it. When you look up St. Paul, Minnesota, it's hard to miss the tower that has the 1 on it. But a lot of people don't know of it, but they sure know of the Empire State Building in New York. And both buildings were supplied by Cold Spring, and both were competing for the same stone, because the architects chose the same construction method. The thing I find fascinating about the Empire State Building is that, and also one of the buildings I restored on Summit Avenue, which is next to one of the many places F. Scott Fitzgerald lived, is called the Colonial, and it was built by an architect who built a building on Cathedral Hill that in their dollars was $324,000. I mean, today the building wouldn't be less than 20 or 30 million. It's made out of giant blocks of stone. The detail work, the masonry work is just, it's just incredible. And it would be unbuildable in today's dollars. But what fascinates me is the Empire State Building, for those, I think Ken Burns did a show on it, but point is, they built a floor a month. The Empire State Building was built with photography, with eyewitnesses, and the Empire State Building was built in 13 months. And I know, as a builder and familiar with the stone techniques, the masonry techniques, and it's not realistic. I mean, the Twin Towers, 9/11, that those structures go down. To rebuild something took forever. And American ingenuity, whether you want to credit it to being American or not, the type of skill sets, lack of cable television, lack of internet, and maybe a different quality of human being. I'm not sure if it has to do with total nutrient content. And I mean, there's a million factors that make humans different today than they were. But I'm wondering, when you have a structure like the Empire State Building being built in 13 months, I wonder if we calculate how many people worked on that project all the way back to the quarries that are supplying not just the Empire State Building, but the First National Bank Building, which is a very impressive building. It's stunning. I've done work in it, and you have to be vetted for that, and it's all said and done, the Empire State Building and the First National Bank Building, just two of many, many buildings that were being built in that period, very significant, a floor a month. We're not talking like the steel girders. We're talking the interiors. We're talking the masons and the carpenters and the people finishing out the terrazzo floors. That's a concrete technique for those that don't know, but the massive amount of work that went into that structure was being completed floor by floor, and you have the entire building being done in 13 months. So on that note, the quantity, like you're saying, the acreage, like what Simon just said about the acreage of some of these fairs, I wonder if what's missing, and I totally want your opinion on this, because I don't know, because when I look at, if you look at the crews that built the Empire State Building and just the First National Bank Building, if you said, give us again, building codes were different. You weren't slowed down by anybody. I mean, we are slowed down by 5-8 different city officials just when the site's running. Like you said, the planning and zoning and BS that we have to deal with now to build anything is a joke. And most of it's financially driven. But here we are in the 1800s, and it's like, we're going to build a giant city, and no one's going to stop them. No one's going to stop them doing anything they want with like zero safety in consideration, or zero, like they may have designed a gorgeous building, but it wasn't like there was a bunch of structural engineers and inspectors headed over there to make sure they didn't build something that was going to fall down at the first earthquake, So I'm wondering, with those two buildings as an example, do you think it's just, you really think it's outside of scalability to have produced any of those fairs, knowing what we know about just these two buildings?
Here's a perfect example of what we were just talking about before when you were asking about, will academia ever come around to seeing something like new views on ancient Egypt or the ancient Maya? Here's a perfect example. This is how your response is a fairly standard would be a very standard academia response. If we went and asked an architect, right? A lot of what you just said, they would say to me, that would be a standard. The idea that it's just not possible in those time frames would be hard for the average for the average academic to wrap their head around. I get that all the time. Because the buildings were built with staff, which is what they're claimed to have been built with. They're claimed to have been built with plaster and wood, right? And that's why it was done so quickly. But we've got two real issues right off the bat. The first issue is they never built roads into the sites. So roads were never, so they're building 700 acres of material, but they don't think of building roads to make the transportation of materials easier. That's the first real big question mark that you've got to deal with. No roads. The second challenge you've got with the whole thing is, at least again from my research on this project, and that is, why do you need to make the buildings look the way they look? Why do they need to be looking like you're from ancient Rome or ancient Greece? And particularly, like you say, if this time frame is supposedly the time of American skyscraper ingenuity, why wouldn't you be building that? Why do you want to build things that look like they're 1,000 years old, as opposed to looking to the new way you're going forward? So everything about sort of every bit of logic that gets put on my lap makes no sense. Or, old world craftsmanship. That's another one I like here. Old world craftsmanship. They did things better in those days. Yes, but if you do things better, it should take longer. It shouldn't take you shorter. If I want to put together something really quick, the difference is the quality of the workmanship, the quality of the detailing. It's beyond perfect. It's outstanding work. And so the more I look at the stories of why this is supposed, I'll give you a really good example. Sorry for rambling, but here's a really good example. Supposedly all of this stuff is built quickly because it's built of staff, this plaster and wood. There's a building at the Buffalo World's Fair, the electric tower. The electric tower is 395 feet high. More so at the Buffalo Electric Tower were elevators that ran to the top that allowed people to, go to the top of the electric tower and see the whole fair from the top. It was included 50 to 100,000 light bulbs that were going to would illuminate at night. It would look like a giant, the tower would almost be burning. Are you going to build that out of wood and plaster? Like they're suggesting you're going to have elevators and people running to the top of a structure with wood and plaster? Of course not. You're going to have to do this with real stone. And that's the problem that hits with the fairs. If the fairs were saying, oh, they did it in 2 years, they did it with real stone, they did it with, and they had an answer for that, maybe you could work with that. But they give you these flimsy responses of building materials that you would not want to build these kind of structures with, and expect them that they're not going to collapse on 50,000 people and kill them. So they have to be real structures. And so just like with ancient Egypt, there's a giant workaround. There's a giant misdirection. Like, here's a simple answer. Let's not talk about it anymore.
Can I just interject here as well? Because the other thing that Howard's pointed out in his books and other podcasts and interviews that he's done on this subject, one of the main architects, I can't remember, you'll have to correct me, Howard, on which one it was in America, was in fact not an architect, but he was given the job of overseeing and designing. Could you just clear that up for me, Howard, if you know what I'm talking about?
That's a lot of them, yeah. Like a good one would, the guy like you would, Jared would know of the names of Burnham and Root, the supposed two guys who are the famed builders of just about everything in the central central United States.
Yeah,
Burnham.
and then I'm not very far from the land of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah. So, but Burnham, he wasn't really an architect. He was a failure at a whole lot of stuff in his life, and then happened to he took some drafting courses at some college eventually, bumped into this other guy, Root, who also has really no skills at all. And they decide after this meeting on the street, let's have an architecture firm together. The next week, Burnham is supposed to meet with John Sherman, the head of the Union stockyards, who decides to give him the job of overseeing the rebuilding of the entire Union stockyards of Chicago, and in the course of that supposedly becomes engaged to Sherman's daughter and marries into the richest family in Chicago, and then goes on supposedly to build not just the fair, but another, I don't know, 600 buildings across the world. What?
Yeah.
What? That's impossible. That story is impossible.
And for the sake of everyone listening, the Empire State Building, the First National Bank building, there were hundreds, maybe thousands of people working daily. And so if you take the acreage size, just to back it up as an outside voice, I'm saying as a builder, remodeler, especially with this period of construction, the very materials they were using were tough, big. Even the wood was denser, stronger, heavier. Everything they were doing required more mechanics, even in period, even 120, 150 years ago. But if you look at the Chicago World's Fair and say each one of those buildings is a complexity of one of those skyscrapers, then there should literally be hundreds of thousands of people working simultaneously. And to your point, the supply routes to supply those constructions, to deliver, even if it was cart and wagon, to deliver the material needed for hundreds of thousands to work, not to mention the cafeteria facilities. And it doesn't make sense to have hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of men going home and showing up to work 12, 15 hours a day. If each one of those structures across many, many, many square city blocks is basically an Empire State Building or a First National Bank building, I can't personally, in period, as a design build period remodeler, as I think an expert, I don't see how you could do that even if you had them without leaving a incredibly much larger ancillary footprint.
Jared, could I just come in here as well? We're all really in agreement, but the other thing that I would point out for the analogy of the Empire State Building, fine building though it is too, all of the pictures of the buildings I have seen from the World Fair are not just built with functionality, they are built artistically as well. So you would need craftsmen to build these. What would you say to that, Howdie? It's not just throw up and that'll do. There's a lot of artistry, if that's the right word I'm looking for here. Yeah,
I'll just say one last thing, and then we can move the conversation to other topics.
Sure.
To discuss. I don't want, but the last thing I'll just say for Jared and for others is, it's photographs of the St. Louis World's Fair's construction, which we have the largest package of. There's probably 1,000 photographs, and I showed them again to my building contractor. And basically they are pictures of completed buildings with scaffolding on the side and nothing around them. And he looked at the pictures, and first thing he said, I don't know what I'm looking at, but where's your stack of wood and your supply of materials that you're going to need for your building? Where's your setup for guys to go to the bathroom? Where's your area to go have guys get something to eat? There isn't even a coffee cup or a sandwich wrapper on the ground. He just looked at the photo and he said, I don't know what this is, but nobody's been at this site for like 8 months.
Jared?
Yeah, and some of those early photos, the only thing for those that are skeptic about it, I have a lot of World War II photos, and the photographers, even in the day, they would scratch out the people and anything they didn't want in the plate for the final photo for the tourists. So a lot of these early plated photography, they could have painted out or got rid of, usually it's very easily to indicate if that was the case, but they could have cleaned up. The argument against is going to be that they cleaned up the photos. On the other hand, it's very interesting to say, okay, we're going to show you pictures of the fair and pictures of the construction. And if there's no construction material, if you're not seeing tents for cafes or a trough for toilets, or, I mean, yeah, okay, not a trough, but the reality is that if you have thousands of workers, then it's a very different animal, though, being a historical restoration remodeler. I can tell you the scaffolding, if you were revamping existing buildings. But what's interesting then is the argument is the buildings were already there. So what's interesting to me is where's the early, Franklin Press articles of, amazing building find and Chicago already had buildings, or, you know what I mean? Where's all the news stories for, pre-existing city in San Francisco found or occupied early, or how is every single news article from every single early, I mean, if we found a giant in a mound in Minnesota, like Minnesota is huge, we have literally mound Minnesota, and there were thousands of mounds between Wisconsin and Minnesota going into the Dakotas, and early reports, it's always giant found in mound, Smithsonian comes out, no more giant. And so we have those early articles indicating that, crazy, ludicrous find, another mound, extraordinary find. And there aren't any news articles that, I mean, if you found a giant city, why aren't there any articles about, they hit it, but why aren't there, how do we explain that the zero reporting on it?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to try to get questions here for Jared, so I don't want to keep monopolizing the conversation. It's nice to talk about.
I'm fascinated by this subject because as a builder guy, I'm super fascinated by it.
Here's the challenge that I came up with. I asked some similar questions, right? As I went deeper and deeper into the research, I started wondering about this stuff myself. And then I realized the answer links to the city fires. That every city in North America, generally in the late 1800s, supposedly went through some kind of giant fire that burned most of the city down, right? There's no city, it doesn't matter, Baltimore, Toronto, Calgary, Chicago, Boston, Seattle, it doesn't matter, pick your city. And then magically the city is rebuilt in a year or two and everything is back to normal and it's all fine. And I started realizing, what if all the city fires are not, and this is just a theory, right? I can't prove it, but the theory is, what if these city fires are not linked over 100 years? What if all these city fires across North America happen within a couple of years? Well, that wouldn't make it random accidental fires, that would make it a war. And when you look at the photographs of these cities, and again, it doesn't matter what city you look at, it more resembles Dresden than it does any 1944 than any city fire I've ever seen. And I'm more leaning to the fact that there was some sort of gigantic worldwide war that took place sometime, whatever, prior to at least the 1860s, 70s. Who knows the depth of time and how long that took and how many hundreds or years are between that and when things started. I mean, my guess is that everybody who lived in these cities might have all been killed off. What we call native Indians may have been the ones who originally lived in these cities, that their oldest myths are this, when they lived in these giant buildings, and then after the reason they were living on the plains or living out in remote areas, because they had to escape. They had to escape not just the 7th Cavalry like they're suggested, they're escaping potentially weapons that are blowing these cities to pieces. And all of this began to link into the idea of how cathedrals were built, and that cathedrals were energy centers, and that they generated a certain type of energy through the cymatics of the rose window and through the construction of the dome and the tower, and then how this energy might have been connected with star forts, and how this could have been literally protective frequency waves from the equivalent of the biblical story of Jericho, where sound is being used to destroy cities, and maybe cities were starting to be built to deflect these sound frequencies, and eventually the cities couldn't hold out anymore. And what we had was basically completely wiped out cities, and a history could start and recreate itself however it wanted to, because there was nobody around to question it. Again, that's all theory, but the city fires, when you start taking all the worldwide of the city fires into it, it starts to get very hard to explain those photographs based on the narrative that's presented.
I'd like to move on, Jared,
Yep.
with a question for you. Jared, impossible sculpting is my question subject matter to you. There is many examples of building craftsmanship way beyond our capabilities that we possess today, certainly in your field of investigation. However, are you familiar? I've got some pictures I'm going to send you in a minute, guys. Are you familiar with the bust of the Veiled Virgin by Giovanni Strozza? The marble bust depicts a young woman with what appears to be a translucent veil, and it is, yet the veil just happens to be translucent marble. In fact, there are at least 2 other sculptors of note that have produced their own versions of the Veiled Virgin. Each of these also defy logic as to how they were created. These other creations were by Raffaello Monti and Pietro Rossi. There are other such statues, such as the release from Deception by the 18th century sculptor Francesco Quiaro. Sorry for my pronunciation. These and others reside in the Cappella San Servo, a 16th century chapel located in Naples, Italy. This piece is exceptional. There are far too many questions as to how this was created. It shows a figure lifting a net partly off them. The net seems to be one color, and yet the same sculptor and piece of material has a pure white marble figure of a man lifting the net from below. I cannot accept that these were carved conventionally or by any means of our technology, or from my lack of comprehension. My offer, do you think they could have grown or printed? It's almost as if people and their surroundings, in essence, have been vitrified to molten stone and molded in some way. Are you familiar with this? And if so, what's your take on it?
This is so bizarre. The Raffaello Monti piece.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. I'm sending pictures now and I'll put them on the video. Carry on, Jared.
No, you don't need to send me the photo. It's absolutely one of my favorite pieces. Is at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. We
Excellent.
have it.
What say you, Jared?
I've grown up since I was a child studying this thing up close for my entire life. I've seen this thing and I stop and I see it every chance I get. But this is this veiled lady. One of them, this Raffaello one, is at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and it went on loan for a little bit a couple of years ago. Dang it! But it came back. But it is one hell of a piece, and I can't. So this is the problem with all standard academia and everything else. Here's one of our issues: we don't get to material test. So unless I can take a core sample out of this thing, or we have any photos from 1860 of him carving it, how do we know? I mean, can't touch it. I can't touch it. I have literally, my breath should have set off the alarms. I mean, God knows I've looked at it as close as I can without touching it. But this piece is incredible. So I can't touch it. And as far as core sampling goes, that's what just happened out of Stonehenge. We finally have core sampling, and we know it's a silicrete concrete, and it's an indestructible advanced geopolymer. But we have that because we have a core sample from 1958 that finally got studied and a paper just got released. But this veiled lady is absolutely, pictures do not do it justice. I didn't think you'd be digging into my childhood and my entire life, but I will grab a coffee and go to the MIA, which is free, and I will walk by this thing every single time. Love this thing.
Are you familiar with the other one that I mentioned? It looks like a cherubim sitting on a globe, and then a guy with a fishing net. It's just beyond my comprehension, and I'm only looking at pictures. I've never seen them.
The veiled lady. I mean, I haven't seen the other one in person. Man, it is, like I said, it looks like I have to download it to open it. So
yeah.
I'm gonna...
What do you say about this, Howard? What's your take on this? Because I just cannot see anybody with again, the 1800s. Anybody could just sculpt away and make could only be, to my mind, a printed. You know what I want to say. I'm just going to be quiet. What do you think, Howard?
Well, I'll take it in another direction too, so Jared can go in a few different directions. But I have some experience with some ancient statues myself, and stories I share sometimes. And that one of it was with the statue of Tutmosis III in the Luxor Museum. It is the most perfectly produced statue of granite or very hard basalt. So never mind the quality of it, the symmetry of it, the perfect geometry of it. It took my attention so much that I just watched it for an hour, or more. And after maybe about 30 or 40 minutes, I started noticing the nostrils of the statue were moving. I started noticing the chest was rising and falling, and I realized the statue's alive. It's actually, it has a life force. It's a living thing. And I realized then that the ancients were building, they weren't just making a statue to look nice. They were infusing an energy or an understanding or a knowledge into everything that they built. And so then the second story I'll turn over to Jared is I took some people to an exhibit in Calgary when some Egyptian pieces came up there. And one gentleman had a really bad back. Like he had to stop every 5 minutes and sit down because he couldn't walk anymore. And I saw this statue of Sekhmet, and luckily it wasn't, but didn't have the glass case around it, so we could actually go and touch it, but they weren't supposed to. But I walked them behind the back and I just said, pretend we're looking at the back of it, put your hand on the statue, don't take it off until I tell you to. So he did that. We stood there for about 10 minutes pretending we were looking at it. I told him to take his hand off the statue, and his back was fine. He had no problems the rest of the day. So it's this idea that I know that whatever we see as a statue, whoever the creator was doing something so much more than that. So I'm wondering if, Jared, if you by chance you've seen so many statues and pieces like this yourself, have you had experiences with the statues that you've been around?
I am super into this is super fun. I have never had the idea until you just painted the picture of, I try to explain to people these large auditoriums, these large Greek in quotes amphitheaters, the idea of frequency and energy healing, that, we're traveling through the universe, we're traveling through the solar system, we're traveling through the galaxy. And despite our ionosphere and a global pyramid or whatever energy system, despite our frequency and energy knowledge, that human beings likely repaired and managed themselves on a cellular level indefinitely for periods of time. And then it mystified. You got Qigong, you got all these mythologies in the last 6,000 years, and that we've kind of, we're getting a response from the blinky board. We bang on it, it works, but we don't get how. And imagine going to that stadium back when it was a high functioning, not only were we watching a play, but with all our synesthesias and all these abilities, we would sit down, and if you had a cold and I had cancer, by the time we left the stadium, we would be healed. I've always been fascinated by these statues. And I've always thought the Corinthian columns, it was like just all of it seemed to indicate a higher energy function. It all seemed to be, and my big thing was looking at terra preta and engineered soils and engineered, seismic metamaterials, so that the soils aren't just for growing, really nutritious food, but for transferring energy and information. And these statues, right down to patterns in clothing, they just didn't make sense that they were just decorative. And I don't know how. I just think it's brilliant. Just the idea that you just painted for everyone out there to consider, that why wouldn't, in quotes, your artwork, I've been stuck on, was there a evil class of advanced ancient human that said, screw it, I don't want to live underground. I'm going to create a godlike society where I sit on a throne and I'll make giant statues of myself. And is that the reason that there are some 2,000-3,000 ton statues of Ramses, in quotes, Ramses, but where they built to just create a fake godlike structure, culture? And then you look at these statues and the idea of them being healing, the idea of them being part of that energy grid and network of not only are you looking at something decorative, but the brain entrainment and all the levels of a much higher functioning human being, not just being reminded of a beauty or a folklore or a story or a mythos, but to actually having, tripped over a step and you're like, oh, I just cannot, despite all my synesthesias or all my connections with other people or the entire energy grid, I just can't cure it. I just can't fix it. Or is it like a symphony? Is it that every building, every structure, the terraformed planet, is it always constantly weaving healing and health? And is it at this point in a disconnected society, he gets healed because he touches it, and the brain entrainment is there, the lines and the precision within the statue. I mean, the blinky board aspect of it, that it's functioning and doing its job despite it being off or not part of the original advanced society that it was a part of. The idea that these statues are part of a complex network that once ran in harmony and now they stand out and they're creating these results. I've never thought of it as far as a function. I've always had the question, though. For years I've been you're listening in real time as Jared finally gets to put another piece of the puzzle into I can't think of anything more resoundingly accurate as to what these statues may function for than to be part of that network of consciousness, healing, the functionality of a cellular level effect. I think it's just a brilliant theoretical, needs to be proved out part of this ancient high-tech society. I think that's dead on what these things are. That's just brilliant.
Oh, thanks. And that's just, like I say, that's just from many personal experiences with statues, with the sites, with whatever. And by the opposite, going to certain sites where I can go and feel that there's nothing there, and then wondering, well, why is there nothing? Or why does this particular statue give off 0?
I think
so. It's also interesting to see which is which.
Yeah, I mean, they mimicked. I mean, this is the part that I can legitimately be empathetic to standard academics. There were brilliant, talented people throughout all of history, and you come across a giant destroyed city like Tanis, and you find a city a little further over that's the same stuff, and you're like, well, this one's less destroyed. There's less to pick up. We'll just quarry from the one city and add over to this city, and then we'll mimic what we find. And I give Easter Island as a great example of that. The first moai are basalt. The oldest moai, the most advanced, polished, well-made, precision. 3 of them are at the British Museum. But the most complex moai statues are made of basalt, and they're the oldest. Later, you have dynastic tribal people showing up using very soft stone and mimicking what they found. There was polygonal masonry on Easter Island. There was a stone sphere, at least one. You have, again, an abandoned high technology site being adapted over thousands of years, being repaired, being updated. You have people mimicking the people who are mimicking, 6,000, 3,000, 2,000, 1,500 years ago. You have multiple generations of possibly not related dynastic peoples mimicking what they find. And then it gets confusing for academics. It gets confusing for any of us looking at a site going, am I looking at a truly old, very precision, original society, megalithic frequency energy society builder thing? Or am I looking at a very, very, very the most talented artist piece survived? Or is it just, that we have those blurred lines through history, and we have to be, I think, always sensitive that, people, really talented, creative people come along and they can get really, really close to some of these ancient pieces, but some of them, and I could also understand why some of the delicacies of these statues, because, Simon's photo came up, but gosh, it would be just really, really hard to start discerning without some destructive investigations, which ones are what.
I think, Jared, that pretty much puts it in a nutshell, because you're being kept away from that very thing, isn't it? You know, you can't say, I mean, would you really want to? I suppose if the truth was on the line, you would maybe take a core sample and things like that. But it seems to be, here's the line and no further. But I personally just see, I'd love to see them. I would love to see them up close. So only, you know, they were right in front of me, but just looking at the pictures are completely mind-boggling. So a question to you, Howard. We're coming into the last 20 minutes, gentlemen. So we'll wrap this up if you're okay for the next 20 minutes, because the subject matter is legion, and we just couldn't possibly cover everything. So my question to you, Howard, if there was one thing apart from death itself, if there was one thing that you could get the answer to from our history, what would be that thing?
You mean like something like if I could get a guaranteed 100% answer of something historical?
Correct.
For me, that would have to be the exact reason for not the method of doing it, but the exact reason for building the giant pyramid structures, the 7 big ones in Egypt. That would be it for me, is actually knowing what they were really 100% guaranteed for.
And if I could send you back in time and guarantee your safety, one trip and one trip only, would that be where you would go to?
Yeah, I'd be going right now.
Jared, same question to you.
Well, I think he nailed it. It's exactly why, as a builder and as a researcher in this, that's why seismic metamaterials are so important. The foundations of those very buildings. And it's ironically, we're answering, I got to interview Mohammed Ibrahim. He had the same thing when I described that the very foundations of these structures, which no one's given a crap about because they're looking for gold and mummies and jewels. And we've talked about this, is that the seismic metamaterials down to the nano-sized structures that, whether it's Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, or the Great Pyramids, all of them are built on foundations that are made of materials that correspond. If we can't go back in time, the answers are literally under our feet. And we have to do the core sampling, and we have to do just like that report that just came out a few days ago about the silicretes that are making up the Sarsen stones of Stonehenge, that these are ancient, advanced, almost indestructible concretes, that they're not just for the longevity of the site, but they represent some sort of high technology, energy frequency, whether it has to do with healing, communication, planetary frequency aligning, whatever it is. We need to get that exact question answered, because it's part of that high-tech society that we are genetically, physically a part of. And I do think they built us to be interconnected, not just with each other, but a planetary biological tech system that we mistake for being, in quotes, natural, which in reality is a giant connected system that, you know, who doesn't want the answers of who, what, where, when, and why? But it lies in these structures. It lies in the very foundations of these structures. The technology is something that we can't ignore. Our history is not a search and recovery. It's a search and rescue, not just for knowledge, but for reconnecting and fully consciously awakening again. It is a search and rescue. And that's what we'll find with these answers. That's why
Howard, would you like to come in with a comment on that?
Well, I mean, he's about as clear spoken on the subject as I could, possibly say. That's what got me involved right away when I first started this. When I began, was this realization that the ancient world had this knowledge, had something that was so far beyond what any of us seem to have today. And his description of it being a search and rescue is perfect, because that was the feeling. It's like, what can be found back there that can be brought back today, because we really need it badly. He said it about as perfect as I could have ever said.
Okay, so before we wrap up in the last 15 minutes, I have one last question for you, and it obviously we'll be asking where we can find you, etc., etc. But one last question for you both, based on the way the interview's gone. And to be honest with you, I've really enjoyed it. On a selfish level, I get to have two of the biggest people on the field of questioning, and it's been brilliant. But so my last question to both of you is: do you think, conspiracy or not, I'm just calling it the way it is. You don't have to comment on this. I'm not allowed to mention COVID or vaccine, and I'm not really coming to that. But do you think, answer whichever one of you want to at the moment, do you think the world is the subject of at worst, hostile takeover bid, or at the better, a rewriting, and out with the old and in with the new? Answer it in whichever guise, or don't. Up to you. So we'll start with you, Howard.
Simple answer is I've come to see this reality now as some type of simulation, some type of experiment. And the experiment is definitely continuing. Exactly who is running the experiment, what the experiment is for, and what the information is attempted to be given, I have no idea. But it's definitely not the way we've been told it is. And one of the things when it comes to history, which is really interesting, and I don't remember who wrote this in some paper, but they said the way you could figure out if the reality you're in is a simulation or not is a programmer. If it was done by a programmer, they will put a tremendous amount of energy into the present and the future, because that's where the simulation is moving. They will not put the same kind of energy into the past to build that up properly. So if you are looking into, he said, if you are looking into history and you can't get really clear, obvious, solid answers, or if a lot of things are unbelievably left with question marks, he said that's a high level of possibility you're living in a simulation. So,
That's a good.
Again, makes you wonder then what experiment are we being run in now? Yeah,
that's true. A good answer, Jared. Over to you on that.
Oh, just for future note, we're not going to let you out of this. We got to get your opinion about where you'd go.
Oh, where would I go? Oh, well, that's an obvious one. I would go back to the time of Pangaea. If my safety is guaranteed, I would want to see the landmass as we humans call Pangaea, and have some sort of means of traveling around, because I didn't actually say how long, so maybe a couple of weeks, just to travel around and to see Pangaea if it existed. So anyway, back to that question, Jared.
Okay.
State of the world, yada yada yada. Sorry.
Well, I think the earlier statement of the mystery about the fires of every major city, of cleaning up history, I have suspected for a long time that, you know, if there are ancient advanced humans still here, and they represent what we describe in quotes as UFOs, and they are, you know, indifferent, or on occasion meddle, or on occasion have deleted some of the more obvious points of their existence or history, or I don't get the reasoning why to keep us in safe mode and to keep us ignorant, or what kind of reckoning would happen if we were fully conscious again. But whether it's the fires, world wars, conflicts like the current one that we were just talking about, to keep us in the safe zone, the reality is it seems like there's a purge, or we need to delete so many scholars, so many historians, so many people who are becoming awake. There always seems to be a situation where an extra amount of deletion of human life has to happen. And I do think there's some sort of tipping point, not that I'm a half full sort of person, but it does appear to be that there is enough people conscious simultaneously that I think the very thin, to the most recent dialogue, veil on keeping that truth from being really right in front of us. And you know, it's one of the things that you can observe about the past, from what we can tell from megalithic builders, is that they lived through many periods of the planet not being able to be controlled. So it's clear that disasters, natural or star-driven from asteroids, meteors, etc., it appears from the extensive underground network that this is a society that lives through many disasters. So from a virtual standpoint, I just wanted to comment on, is it possible that a society like that would constantly run simulations and constantly run, what's our worst case scenario? Like, will we digress into the warlocks of H.G. Wells? Is this what warlocks look like? Is it us? And what is their worst case scenario for a society that forgets what they are? Or is this the experiment that shows one of the, after XYZ number of impacts and issues, is this the society that we end up with? And, or, are they able to come out of this level of BIOS, non-bootable, efficient actual running software? Is this what biotechnology ends up as in the worst case scenario of safe mode? And so I think this entire future and direction of humanity, it's gonna only work if, for some people, it's to ask the questions that we've been trying to answer and ask. We have to go beyond asking the questions. We have to get to answering the questions. And in order to do that, it's going to take awareness, the driving, just the entertainment value of what our conversation is, to get some people who aren't even, awake enough to ask the questions to go, that's an interesting subject. And for those that already are, to say, I hadn't thought about that direction, I'm going to go down those rabbit holes. And then for others to say, yeah, I'm willing to go on an expedition and I'm willing to fund it. And I can't go, but I'm willing to fund it. And for all of us to continue on these podcasts and shows and in future writings and histories to keep trying to actualize that search and rescue. And I don't think that it's out of possibilities yet for us to overcome some of these obstacles that seem to be suspiciously placed in our way by what we currently politely call the gray state. But I don't think it's any one organization or one group of people, or is it even our great ancestors kind of putting some sort of a wedge in it? It does. The whole thing is, on one level, just very frustrating, and on another level, well, it's a lot of different things, but overall, I think it's very exciting and positive.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you gentlemen for your time today. I have really enjoyed this cast between us, and I really appreciate you speaking the truth. I find you both really interesting, and we can't cover everything. We really can't, but I would ask you both to maybe consider come back onto the show sometime. So Howard, if with my thanks, if you could tell everybody where they can find you, tell any events maybe coming up, and
first I just wanted to say thanks for introducing me to Jared. I mean, this is a really well-researched, clear-spoken, clear-seeing individual who is doing some tremendous work and who I have very similar thoughts and ideas with. So first of all, thanks for doing this and introducing me to him. This has been really enjoyable. Secondly, my YouTube channel, at least for now, is still running. Howdie Mickoski Talks, and you can check various subjects on there. My books, if you Google my name and search into Amazon, you'll pick up The Power of Then, which is on ancient Egypt, Falling for Truth, which is story of my death experience. And I have a new revised book, Exposing the Expositions is now up. So it's cleaned up, there's more material added to it. And that's the best places to go and start your search if you're looking for more info on me. Thanks.
Jared.
Oh, right back at you. I mean, we're going to have to stay online after this, because I definitely would love to have you on my show. And for us this is just, I feel like, a great opening dialogue to absolutely, brilliant work and research. This has been just a wonderful morning, and it's just been great. For anyone listening out there, I don't really feel like we were working very hard. I feel like it was just fun to meet someone that has done clearly a lot longer, but the amount of research and the work that we're overlapping on it's just really exciting to hear everything that you've done, and just to have the conversation we've had. It's been great. Simon, thanks for having us and putting us together.
You're very welcome, Jared. Tell us where we can find you. Give us a brief overview of what's going on in the next couple of days, and We'll carry on.
Yeah. So notaliens.com. That generally will be, it's going through a facelift. Notaliens.com, on Rockfin, on YouTube, and notaliens.com. It's the same name everywhere you go. And there is a member area on Not Aliens. Feel free to join. Otherwise, join on YouTube or look for me on Rockfin on the premium area. And then there's exclusive content, interviews, et cetera, And then I'll be in the Grand Canyon first week of September, but with Rex from Leak Project, I co-host a couple shows, including Everything Imaginable, Cosmic Salon, and Dark Hour Paranormal. I guest on those shows regularly every month and frequently on Spaced Out Radio. And I have reoccurring, I show up on lots of other places from Coast to Coast or Richard Syrett's shows. And, so there's always all that stuff. But then for now, also, and first and foremost, Simon, here we are.
Yes, you are.
Consistently.
And just, yes, and always welcome. And both of you always are. You know where the key is. Let yourself in if I'm not here, but leave the whiskey alone, Jared. So just lastly, Jared, all of your expedition will be filmed and you'll be bringing out a documentary that we could all enjoy in the future. Am I right?
Absolutely. Even the preliminary one. And then when we go back for what looks to be 2 or 3 weeks, all that will be filmed, and some of it we'll maybe interview even on site while we're doing the work.
Jared Murphy, Howdie Mickoski, thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for having us. It was just wonderful.
And that was the Jared Murphy and Howdie Mickoski interview. Time was really against us on this one, as both Howdie and Jared have a massive subject matter in which they cover, and as you have heard, both go into great detail on these subjects. I think Howdie and Jared definitely bounced off each other, and I can tell you they will be definitely collaborating on a future show on Jared's channel, notaliens.com. So keep an eye out for that, as it promises to be epic. Jared leaves in a few days, heading for the Grand Canyon on the first stage of his expedition, searching for caves along its high walls. As Jared stated, this undertaking is not something that can be taken lightly, as potential for accidents is high, and mitigation of the many risks is top priority. The subsequent documentary coming out of this first reconnaissance to the canyon promises to be fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to it. Jared's mission is definitely high risk. The potential finds could be mind-blowing, and I wish him good hunting and the best of luck. It was really great to have Howdie Mickoski back onto the show, and his fascinating insight into the subjects we covered today, and I would definitely encourage you to check out his channel on YouTube, Howdie Mickoski Talks. He gives in-depth, well-presented talks on many subjects, and you will not be disappointed. Of that, I can assure you. My recommendations would be to start off with his presentations of the strangeness that were the world fairs. Definitely a head-turner. My thanks to you, my dear listeners, for your time also today, and I hope you enjoyed this cast as much as I have. Please feel free to like and share the show, and consider subscribing also if you'd be so kind. You can find the show on most of the podcast platforms, including YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Feel free to leave a comment below or drop the show an email, the slkpodcast@gmail.com. But either way, please keep them kind. And so, my friends, it's time for me to go. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, bye.
Slick Podcast. Keeping it real and always keeping it groovy.